college during the colonial and apartheid years here in South Africa. The University of Fort Hare built a reputation of producing great African leaders. This happened through the midst of a system of segregation that sought to undermine and dehumanize all black people. Some of the students at the institution remained resolute in their struggle to fight against apartheid and for accessible higher education for all. Now, for more on the University of Fort Hare before the democratic era, we're joined by one of the institution's alumni, also the current Vice Chancellor at the University of South Africa, Professor Mandla Makhanya. Very good morning to you, Professor, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me here this morning.
An alumni at an institution that today marks 100 years. Just tell us, Professor, how do you reflect on this?
Well, it's an interesting one, honestly, because, Fort Hare has meant a lot for us as Africans. I think the very fact that many of our leaders had studied, through Fort Hare, that itself, had a huge impact, across this country, as well as beyond the borders of this country. Fort Hare was known virtually everywhere. So I can tell you now that as young people, we were all aspiring to be Fort Hareans one day. So it was not accidental that one ended up there as a student.
Professor, if you look at today versus the time that you spent there, one could say that Fort Hare for 100 years have always had a very Afrocentric outlook on the world, if one could call it that. Whereas today the universities are often at odds in South Africa with students over what students call a more Eurocentric outlook and something that they cannot identify with. How do you view this, and what is the lessons in there for us?
Well, I think that there's a lot to learn from how Fort Hare has in fact managed, to survive for the last century. I mean, I remember very well that the very first time when we landed at Fort Hare, I mean, that as students, you will always have this view that you have some ideas to share. It was very interesting. The very first encounter in our case was when our own senior students made it very clear that no, guys, you are still very young. There are no ideas that you are going to be sharing here. In fact, you are here to have an opportunity, to begin learning what is going on in the world, and thereafter you can begin to argue that you want to share some ideas. And the other thing, which was obviously the most exciting, was the clear indication of what it means, to be African, the excitement around it, and of course the recognition that you had to be proud about who you are, and of course the contribution that you can make. And the studies themselves, ventured into exploring the field, around African studies. Even whatever else that you were studying, the approach will intimately reflect, the exciting part of being African, which for us was really an eye-opener. And I can tell you that there's nothing that was as exciting as the times that we spent during our years of study at Fort Hare. The other thing which, of course, was most exciting was that, you think about the curriculum in the lecture room setting. But what I always admired, with our university was what you learned, from your own peers. That is our own senior students. I mean, I always marveled at the power of their ideas, particularly when we were on strikes, and so on, that you were just looking forward to be in those mass meetings. I mean, you didn't even bother to be worried about the hours that you'll be spending there, because you were saying that you were learning something that you would not have learned anywhere else. This was the best opportunity. I mean, we used to argue that we had what we refer to as a day university. But whenever we were spending time at those mass meetings, we used to argue that this is a special university within the university.
You talk about the strength of ideas, and that, of course, sets itself apart. But there's also academic independence that is something that Fort Hare has fought for 100 years. When you reflect back on academic independence, where are we today? Are we in a happy place?
Well, in all honesty, we are not in a happy place. We are working very hard, in trying to make some progress, towards getting there. It is a long journey, but I don't think we need to rest on our laurels, particularly in areas where we've made some advances. The bottom line is that there's still much more work to be done. We need to make huge investments in this area so that even universities where there is a strong feeling that universities have not necessarily made some headway, that they need to actually continue working hard in this area so that students can actually be satisfied about studying in such universities and, of course, identifying themselves with those universities. It is therefore clear that we have to be clear about the curriculum, that the curriculum must actually reflect us, and we must be the primary sources of the knowledge production rather than the recipients, of knowledge from elsewhere in the world.
Yeah.
I think we need to accept that this continent has done a lot in the area of education and higher education in particular. So we are leaders, and we need to claim that particular space. It is for that reason that we basically are calling on all universities to begin taking this particular area seriously so that they may not be accused really of moving into this area in a half-hearted fashion. But I do know that it will, of course, require, a lot of integration of the Afrocentricity, as an approach in our own studies, as opposed to the Eurocentric, approach that has, in fact, been a reality in universities for a very long time. Why I'm saying this, it's because Fort Hare had consistently been working hard, particularly in areas where we had studied, where our own lecturers were clear about that they wanted us to have a balanced view about that reality that we'll be finding out once we leave universities. So it was not a surprise to us that having completed our studies at Fort Hare, in other walks of life, we didn't find ourselves, as aliens or strangers, but we found that whatever experiences that were there are things that we had already been grounded on.
Professor, thank you for that contribution today. That's the Vice Chancellor at the University of South Africa, Professor Mandla Makhanya. He came to us live from the capital here in South Africa, that is Pretoria. Tshwane to you, and of course, he is an alumni at Fort Hare University. Of course, today, February 8, 2016, it's a milestone. University of Fort Hare is 100 years old. Well, today the institution is celebrating its anniversary in the town of Alice in the Eastern Cape.